Welcome back to the scribing series of videos. In part 1 we looked at scribing infills. In part 2 we looked at scribing face frames. In this concluding part 3 we're going to be looking at scribing to a ceiling. That's coming up next. Now, ceiling scribes occupy a special place in the scribing trilogy simply because it's an area where you can get extremes of scribes, extreme variation between the highest and the lowest point. This is obviously a mock-up of a ceiling with a big sort of bow in it, but this is not the most extreme I've come across by any stretch of the imagination. We've got about 50mm at this end and about 17 in the centre. That's only a 33mm variation across the width of a cabinet. I've fitted wardrobes with more than 50mm, over 2 inches of variation from one end to the next. That's a lot of scribing, and fairly obviously it needs a slightly different approach to the relatively mild variations in scribe that we've had for the face frames and for the infills. I'm going to do two. There are many ways in which to do these scribes. I'm going to cover the two that I use regularly. One is just simply and easily with little blocks of wood, and the other one I'm going to do is what they call an infinity scribe using our U-scribe jigs, and we'll start with that one. Alright, so we've got our U-scribe jigs screwed onto our infill, and we've got the jigs attached to the carcass, so the top of the infill is flush with the top of the carcass. We need to work out what the minimum distance is. I said I reckon is about 17mm. What I'm going to do is just run a little piece of offcut flush with the top of the cabinet and the top of the infill, and use my combination square just to set that, and then I'm going to transfer that to the bottom of the infill. And then what we need to do is work out the distance from that scribe line, because that's going to be the bottom of our scribe, up to the top. And with a piece of offcut trimmed back to the correct height, I can use that to mark our scribe line. So fairly obviously with a scribe that extreme, with a scoop that deep, I'm not going to go near that with a hand plane or even a power plane. That's going to be a jigsaw and rasp, I think, to get that anywhere near close. One thing that you will need to watch out for, that I'll need to watch out for when I'm doing a scribe like this, is obviously in the centre section it's pretty thin in there, so as well as keeping your fingers out of the way, just have to make sure that we don't put the workpiece under any great pressure, otherwise that's potentially could snap, and that's all your hard work down the Swanee. Anyway, let's give that a whirl and see how we go. So with the initial cut done with the jigsaw, we can put a back bevel on this with a power planer. Okay, took a little bit more work than I thought. A few more tools. Jigsaw, power plane just to put a back bevel on it, a little bit of hand plane and a rasp as well. One of the other reasons that we put a back bevel on it is not just to make our life easier when we're doing the scribe, it's also because often the ceilings or the pieces that we're scribing to aren't even all the way in. I hadn't realised I'd been quite so authentic with this, but this does actually get fatter as you go further back, so I have had to put a bit of a extra back bevel on it just to get it to fit, because the scribe line is only good for the very front, of course, but that is just about there. Could it be better? Yeah, probably. 4:30 on a Friday, that's call kit and go home sort of scribe. So not too bad. Alright, so the other way that I would do this is just using little blocks of scraps of MDF, little offcuts. I've got the offcut here. I've already put it on the inside of the carcass and measured up to the lowest point, so we need to know exactly how big our scribe needs to be, our infill. I've transferred those marks across to the infill, and I've trimmed that down so it's exactly the right size. I'm going to put some little pieces of double-sided tape on the inside edges of these marks and just tape it to the infill, and then get this fixed in place, and then we can scribe our line. So just like when we did the infill, we've got our scribe mark. It's up at the lowest point it can possibly be. We've got the little blocks on the inside keeping it away, and just like when we did the infill and the face frames, we're using an offcut of the carcass material and an offcut of the block, the offset block that's in there. We're going to put those two together, and then we're going to scribe our line just as we did before. Alright, so scribe line marked. We can just unpick these little blocks because they're just on with double-sided. Then we can get that trimmed back and rasped and get it fitted. So as before, we've got that slightly tricky sort of back bevel just on that very sort of steep scoop. I've actually been persuaded to dredge up the little belt sander. It seems to be working surprisingly well, actually, so we'll carry on with that. Keep fine-tuning it, trimming it back a little bit, then we'll get this fitted in 2 shakes. Okay, so there we are, a little bit of fine-tuning with a belt sander, of all things. And that is just about ready to slip in. It's not quite 100%. I've gone a little bit too deep on this right hand side. But again, most of these are going to need to be caulked anyway. I'm not pretending this is perfect by any stretch of the imagination, but it's not bad. And all that one took was a couple of little blocks of scrap and some sticky tape. And when it comes to fixing the ceiling infill like this in place, what I use is just a very small headed screw called Loctite, and you can just drive this screw up through the carcass top, and because the head is so small it virtually disappears. If this was a painted carcass you could fill that easily, and even with a veneered carcass like this you can fill that with wax. I'll have a video out before too long about how we do that. So there we are, that's our extreme scribe up to a ceiling. It's not the best scribe I've ever done, I've got to be honest. It's not the worst either. It is good enough because that would be eminently caulkable, and the vast majority of these are going to be caulked. If you've joined us from the very start of this series, you'll have seen, of course, how I scribe an infill between the wall and the cabinet. You'll have seen how I scribe a face frame, whether it's flush with the inside of the cabinet or overhanging, and indeed this sort of extreme scribe up to a ceiling like this. Hopefully it's come across loud and clear that it's not rocket science, there's no magic to it, it's not some sort of dark art, it's just a question of calculating your offset, scribing your line carefully, and then just cutting to that line very carefully indeed. I've used all kinds of different tools to do this with. We've got a whole host of primary coloured scribing gadgets, but you can also do this with a simple pair of compasses, of course, and one of the best scribes that I did was with just a little block of wood and a rasp. I've used all kinds of other tools as well, of course. I've got the jigsaw, the belt sander, the hand plane, the power plane, and again the simple rasp works really well for getting into those really tight scoops. If you've enjoyed the series, well, come and join the Patreon party. I want to give a quick shout out and say thank you very much to all of my Patreon supporters, because the support they give and the contributions they make really do help to keep the lights on here. And one of the things I do for my Patreon supporters is a little bit of extra content. There's a behind the scenes of this particular video series, as well as some bonus content that isn't in the main YouTube channel. So please come and join us at the Patreon party. There are links down in the video description to how to join Patreon, as well as links to all the handy little gadgets that we've shown during the course of this series. But that really is it for this video. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you next time. Take care.